History is Mystery, Chapter 2. If anybody's watching, could you do me a favor and leave me a comment verifying that you can hear me, please? Anyone's watching and you can hear me, go ahead and leave that comment now. See how long this chapter is real quick. 35 to, okay. It's not too bad. Anyways, let's get started. Chapter 2. Priests and Pagans, Saints and Slaves. Historically, history is largely a one-sided record composed by the victors. This is a well demonstrated by the sanitized history of the origins of the triumph of Christianity, while acknowledging such aberrations as the Inquisition and the Church's suppression of scientific investigators like Galileo. The popularized accounts depict Christianity as having been a civilized force in late antiquity, a beacon of light in the Dark Ages, and a citadel of faith and learning throughout the medieval times. The reality is something else. For more than 1,000 years, the higher clergy presided as rich and powerful ecclesiarchal lords over vast statuaries, owners of slaves and masters of serfs, exercising a regressive influence upon every area of culture and learning. Triumph over one true faith. In ancient Rome, the pagan rule generally was more tolerant of Christianity than Christianity was of paganism once the Christians gained the upper hand. The polytheistic tolerance of Christianity than Christianity was paganism once Christians gained the upper hand. Yeah, one more time, sorry. In ancient Rome, pagan rule generally was more tolerant of Christianity than Christianity was of paganism once the Christians gained the upper hand. The polytheistic pagans welcomed all manner of gods at the pantheon, with new deities being added over time. What discomforted them about Christianity was its unyielding monotheism and its readiness to regard every form of worship as impious and idolatrous. Here was an obscure sect that proffered a fantastical cosmic scenario of everlasting salvation for proselytes and eternal flames for the heathens and their ancestors. To the extent that it existed, pagan repression of Christianity seems propelled more by political than theological considerations. The pagan side had its zealots, those who deeply believed in the old order and who blamed the Christian sect for all of Rome's maladies. Ever wary of private societies, the empire kept a mistrusting eye of the recalcitrant Jesus worshippers who might be induced to pray for the emperor but never to him. With their unlicensed, secretive international associations and militant messianic belief in the Christos God King, the Christians did not fit comfortably into the polytheistic pantheon over which the deified Roman emperor presided. Disloyalty to Polity's gods was seen as being not far from disloyalty to Polity himself. In his well-known correspondence with Emperor Trajan late in the 1st century AD, the young Pliny made clear that official concern was more political than religious. He informs the practice of secretly meeting since my edicts issued on your instructions, which banned all political societies, unquote. Membership in this, quote, wretched cult were sent away to be executed for their disloyalty. Trajan supported Pliny's measures, but counseled against an excess of inquisitional zeal. Quote, these people must not be hunted out, unquote. And if they repent, they must be pardoned no matter how suspect their past conduct may have been. Quote, but pamphlets circulated anonymously must play no part in any accusation. They create the worst sort of precedent and are quite out of keeping with the spirit of our age. Unquote. During the first 3 centuries AD, although an illegal institution, the Christian Church was usually left to itself as long as it did not foment disturbances. In the school of Rome and Athens, religion was not a prejudicial factor for either teachers or students. One could confess faith in either Jupiter or Jesus schools. Generally, out of concern for peace and stability, the pagan emperors discouraged any heated outcry against the Jesus followers. Unlike the eager Pliny, the average Roman governor was averse to coming down hard on the Christians brought before him, preferring to reclaim rather than punish the deluded enthusiasts, urging them to make a minimal uh, obeisance to the emperor, or just take some simple oath that might serve as an excuse to release them. Sorry, someone texted me. It all sounded so, okay, to the governors, quote, it all sounded so odd, this doctrine of resurrection, body and all, and this trust in books by St. Paul, quote, was he not a common sort of chap who spoke Aramaic, unquote? A governor of Egypt that's said to have asked Bishop Phileas in c. 305, quote, surely he was not in the same class as Plato, unquote. Well then, another despairing governor had asked in Smyrna in March 250, quote, do you pay attention to the air? If so, sacrifice the air instead. I do not pay attention to the air, replied his prisoners, but to him who made the air, the heaven and everything in it, quote, tell me then who did make it, quote. It is not right for me to tell, quote. This childlike obstinacy was very irritating, quote. Do you want to wait a few days, think it's over? Asked the governor who tried Caliphus, also in Egypt in the early 4th century. Don't you see the beauty of this pleasant weather? Asked the hopeful judge. No pleasure will come your way if you kill yourself, but listen to me and you will be saved. Quote, the death which is coming to me, quote, Caliphus said, had to have answered, quote, is more pleasant than the life which you would give, unquote. Christianity, writes Mattingly, was a religion of peace with the peace of God in its heart. One would never know it from the way Christians attacked other Christians whose views deviated somewhat from their own. Over and above their clashes with pagan authorities, Christ believers waged uncompromising fratricidal war, often over doctrinal esoterica that might seem oddly frivolous to modern readers. Christianity's early history, quote, was more plagued by splits with the church than by threats from without, unquote, notes Joyce Salisbury. According to Edward Gibbon, the Christians inflicted far greater casualties on each other in the course of their internecine conflicts than ever visited upon them by the infidels. This bloodletting continued well beyond the Reformation era. Relying on Grotius, Gibbon notes that the number of Christians executed by other Christians in a single province during the reign of Charles V far exceeds that of all the martyrs who perished at the hands of the pagans throughout the entire Roman Empire in the space of 3 centuries. Almost from Christianity's inception, charges of criminal misconduct were regularly hurled by one Christian sect against leaders of another. Paul himself putatively was a victim of such factional strife in Rome. Early in its existence, the church oh, hold on. Early in its existence, fuck, I hate it when that happens. All right, fuck it, I'll start from here. Almost from Christianity's inception, charges of criminal misconduct were regularly hurled by one Christian against another. Paul himself putatively was a victim of such factional strife in Rome. Early in its existence, the church did its utmost to suppress Gnosticism, Marcionism, and Montanism, followed with campaigns against various other heretical offshoots. Strife between Christian sects in Rome was violent enough to necessitate intervention by the empire and city prefect. In 317, in cities throughout the northern Africa, riots between the Donatist Christians, the Catholic Christians, cost numerous lives. There was a dimension of class struggle in some of these conflicts. Donatism found its strongest following among the lower orders, whose rejection of the college or the Church of Carthage was part of their hostility towards the rich. Donatist social rebels led what Joseph Vogt calls quote, undiscipled mobs to, quote, drive out the Roman proprietors and compel hated slave owners to perform servile tasks, unquote. Not until well into the 4th century, when the dominant sect was established by the empire preferred religion, was Christianity's doctrinal orthodoxy firmly secured. It is usually taught with Christianity won the hearts and the minds of antiquity in part because of the inspirational examples set by its martyrs. Perone writes that, quote, faced death calmly, confidently, and with prayers of forgiveness on their lips, deeply impressed their pagan brethren, and, and Gibbon claims that many Gentile spectators were converted by the enthusiasm of the condemned proselytes. The blood of the martyrs became the seed of the church. What evidence we have would seem to indicate something less inspirational. While we kept vividly alive in the modern imagination by popular novels like Ben-Hur and Hollywood films of Christians being thrown to the lions, persecution, quote, remained an exceptional occasion, unquote, according to Michael Grant. Between Nero's cruel campaign in AD 64-68 and the limited one launched during the reign of Diocletian in AD 303-304, there were long periods of toleration, marred with sporadic incidents of harassment and repression. Regarding the Diocletian, quote, great persecution, unquote, a leading Catholic historian, Monsignor Dutchins, I cannot pronounce that name, found only a score of proved cases of martyrdom in the entire empire. In the brief interlude of 361 to 363, after Christianity had become the established religion, a cautious and largely ineffectual pagan restoration was attempted by Emperor Julian the Apostate, a campaign, quote, not pressed to the point of shedding blood, unquote, notes one Catholic writer. Origen, a church leader writing in the 3rd century, candidly admits that those who had died for their faith were few and easily numbered, despite his assertion that martyrdom was the seeds of the church. Even Gibbon judges the actual victims to be, quote, an inconsiderable number. He speculates that their ranks may have been misleadingly magnified by the custom of bestowing the title of martyr on all confessors of faith. W.H.C. Friend remarks not only, quote, hundreds, not thousands of Christians were ever martyred, and Rodney Stark concludes that the Roman government seems to have cared very little about the Christian menace. There was surprisingly little effort to persecute Christians. Persecutions were infrequent and involved very few people. The early Christians may have faced some degree of social stigma, but little actual repression, unquote. If so, how prevalent could martyrdom have been as a proselytizing tool? To be sure, some individuals like Justin Martyr converted to Christianity after witnessing Christians bravely face death, but whether the martyr's heroism explains Christianity's triumph is another matter. Even by Christian accounts, those most impressed by such sacrifices were other believers who convinced themselves that the Holy Spirit abated their comrades in their final ordeal. The number of pagans who actually saw Christians die in the arena could not have been a substantial portion of the empire's population, and the numbers who thereby experienced a religious conversion would have been very few by far. From the accounts we have, the arena crowds usually threw stones and heaped abuse upon the aspiring martyrs, offered by what the pagans perceived as their moral and spiritual arrogance. It was the pagan populace who demanded that Cyprian, bishop of Carthage, to be thrown to the lions. Quote, the impatient clamor of the multitude denounced the Christians as the enemies of God and man, unquote, and there is no evidence of a public outcry of any sort to stop the execution of Christians. Had there been, we would have heard of it through Christian sources. Had some Christian clergy strongly opposed the enthusiasms of the martyrs, further suggests that martyrdom was not a bountiful source of recruitments. Bearing witness to martyrdom sometimes actually had a chilling effect. Far from inspiring emulation among the unconverted, Vipia Perpetua insistence on going to her death in the arena visited dismay and sorrow upon her heathen kin and acquaintances. Furthermore, there were many examples of backsliding Christians, including the earliest group of bishops who fortitude to persevere in their convictions when faced with threat of extinction. Just as the martyrs may have inspired brethren to keep the faith, so the terrified retractions of less resolute believers bred hesitation and even apostasy among co-religionists. In the final analysis, Christianity's triumph owed more to Constantine's state power than to the exemplary inspiration of martyrdom or to mass enthusiasms. To be sure, Christianity's pre-sentence presented a more gratifying belief system than paganism, with promises of a blissful hereafter and a solicitude of a loving, providential God. It also offered earthly rewards, noticeably a close community of worshippers and some limited measure of care for widows, children, and the elderly. Not all donations were pocketed by the clergy. Some portions went to charity, unlike contributions to pagans' temples, which were expanded on feasts and drinking bouts. Paganism generated little sense of connection to a loving, all-wise Godhead, offered instead to an ever-increasing number of paratrial gods, themselves of sometimes imperfect morality. Stark examples of Christianity's early growth was due to A, the communal social care that Christians provided for their brethren, which allowed for a higher survival rate among Christians than pagans during epidemics. The evidence he gives for this is at best scant. B, the church's prohibition against the common practice of infanticide, abortion, a birth control, endowing Christians with a faster population growth, and C, the higher conversion rate of pagan husbands who were married to Christian women. Still, the early growth of Christianity could not have been all that dramatic. Early in the 3rd century, Origen observed that the number of faithful was Antioch and Rome, or quite inconsiderable. Extrapolating from what he knew about Antioch and Rome, Gibbon guesses that no more than 5% of the empire's population enlisted themselves under Christ's banner in the pre-Constantine era. To be sure, the Christian society was widely tolerated and viable organization. By the early 4th century, even before Constantine elevated to the official status, its well-knit structure and often prestigious membership were probably the very things that convinced the emperor to incorporate it into his political base. But none of these considerations lessen the importance of the immense material support offered by the church by Constantine and the Christian emperors who came after him. Constantine's edict of 313 withdrew state recognition of the traditional gods with the appearance of tolerance that initially placed all faith on equal footing, facing a large pagan majority in the Senate and throughout the empire. The emperor moved cautiously at times. He granted permission for pagan temples to be built in Constantinople and, as late as 331, erected several himself in areas where pagan sentiments must have been especially strong. Most other times, he vigorously promoted Christianity as his personal religion with rescripts and other public communications. Constantine restored property and meeting houses taken from Christians during the Diocletian persecution of the previous decade. He provided the church with regular state revenues, mostly in landed property and crop shares, and granted it the right to accept legacies in a matter of years. The emperor's ruling helped to transform the Christian sect into a state-chartered church universal, with majestic edifices and imposing rituals. Under Constantine, bishops were made privileged dignitaries and entrusted with official duties, enjoying jurisdiction over civil states with Christian communities and over capital crimes involving other bishops, who were granted the aristocratic privilege of being tried by their peers. Christian clergy were exempted from imposts and granted immunity from municipal tributes. Such favored tributes induced a sudden spate of conversations by various wealthy individuals who sought to secure tax-free episcopal posts. Constantine built a chain of lavish churches from Rome to the Holy Land, and in 321, the state officially adopted the Lord's Day, declaring Sunday a public holiday. At the same time, the first Christian emperor made sure to tighten his grip on secular power. Constantine murdered his son, his wife, and the 11-year-old of a vanquished rival, while plunging into wars that caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands, setting an example that was to be emulated by other Christian rulers over the centuries. Uh, Burckhardt notes that the church leader, quote, uttered no word of displeasure against the murderous egoist, unquote. Enjoying every guarantee of favor from Constantine, the well-organized clergy became, quote, the most devoted agents for spreading his power, completely disregarding the fact that he stood with one foot in paganism and hands drenched in blood. While Constantine's conversion to Christianity was sincere and still debated, whether Constantine's conversion to Christianity was sincere is still debated. Most important is the impact it had upon the religious landscape. Under his rule, the church gained a measure of political and material wealth that opened the way for its temporal triumph. Just as Christianity waxed upon being granted official sanction, so did paganism's wane. In the 4th century, paganism was far from moribund, but since Constantine defunded its shrines and diverted its treasures to Christian coffers, and once the ancient temples lost their claim over local taxes, estate donations, festivals, pagans began to decline precipitously. Mindful of the power of the newly installed Christian magistrates, substantial numbers of empire subjects took to the reigning faith. In 1 year alone, 12,000 men were baptized in Rome, along with a proportional number of women and children. As the church's earthly power flourished, so did its enmity towards any kind of theological deviation. Generally, a willingness to tolerate dissents does not increase with a group's sense of empowerment. In the years after Constantine, the practices of Holy Communion and baptism were enforced by the police, while the bishops prevailed upon the secular rulers to suppress all competing beliefs. In April 356, Constantius II, Constantine's successor, issued an edict that sanctioned death for persons convicted of worshipping idols. The true believers of Christ deprived pagans of their houses of worship, destroyed their literature and sacred lions, and tortured them. Quote, in authority in the city, unquote, to them to admit to their religious fraud. Riots incited by the closing of pagan temples, only spurred by bishops to demand more severely repressive measures. The determination to increase the opportunities for faith was a euphemism for suppressing any credo that departed from the one true faith. As Augustine and others argued, coercion against pagans and against Christians who reverted to paganism was a virtue. For Christians, for Christ, it was a general who must use military means to retrieve deserters. In his famous debate with Saint Ambrose, the learned pagan aristocrat, Symmachus made a last-ditch plea for religious tolerance and freedom of conscience. Quote, since I do not repent, permit me to continue in the practice of my ancient rites. Since I am born free, allow me to enjoy my domestic institutions, unquote. Predictably, Ambrose, Archbishop of Milan, responded that Christianity alone was the doctrine of truth, and that every form of polytheism led only to the abyss of eternal perdition. Ambrose's friend, Emperor Theodosius, drove back the archbishop's arguments by arbitrarily forcing Symmachus into exile. Theodosius then propelled the hasty conversion of the Roman Senate, which, keenly aware of the dangers of opposing a determined monarch, voted by a lopsided majority for Jesus against Jupiter. As Burckhardt notes, the pagans, quote, did not know, for they forgot that Christianity, once tolerated, must inevitably become the predominant religion. Indeed, its determined intent was to become the only religion. By January 395, paganism was completely banished from public life and largely suppressed as a faith, with, quote, the one true church, universal, apostolic, and Roman, unquote, established by law. Hearsay was now likened to subversion. The pagan rites of animal sacrifice and divination were declared a crime of high treason against the state. The use of garlands, frankincense, and libations of wine, and other harmless ceremonies subjected the offenders to forfeiture of his home and estate, or a heavy fine of gold and silver. Those who failed to report or punish such deeds faced equally severe sanctions. Silencing the pagans. Anyone attempting to investigate pagan critiques of early Christianity discovers that such literature no longer exists. It was systematically destroyed by church authorities after Christianity became the approved religion early in the 4th century. To determine what pagan writers thought about Christianity, modern research must forage for comments in letters and writings dealing with other topics. Other fragments survive, ironically, because they are quoted by Christian polemicists who are bent on refuting them. One tireless critic was the 3rd century philosopher uh, Porphyry, a Neoplatonist theist and student of Plotinus. The, Christ- the surviving remnants of his 15th volume, Against the Christians, contained many surprisingly modern sounding arguments that evoked critical responses from several generations of Christian writers, including church fathers like Jerome and Augustine. To their credit, Porphyry and other pagan philosophers gave no currency to widely circulated accusations that Christians practiced ritual murder, incest, cannibalism, and group sex. Instead, they concentrated on what was to them Christianity's highly improbable history and theology, posing such questions as, why would God select a backwater as Galilee to send his son? And why such laborious and haphazard method of propagating the faith across the entire world? Oh, I'm getting nearsighted. Why would an omnipotent, omniscient God need to descend to earth in human form to bring about a moral reformation? Why would God so heartlessly deny an opportunity for salvation to the countless generations born before the advent of Jesus? Was it only then, after such a long period, that he remembered to judge the human race? How does it happen that Christians take their origins from Judaism, yet despite some of the very things that Jewish scriptures teach, why did God give contradictory laws to Moses and Jesus? If the Gospels are eyewitness reports, why do they give such widely conflicting accounts of Christ's suffering and crucifixion? Why do the miraculous events described by the Gospels seem so fraught with deceit and trickery, as when a tiny placid lake of Galilee is described as a tumultuous sea that Jesus calms and walks upon? So basically, why was the lake that Jesus walked on described as an ocean when it was really just a tiny lake? Why did Peter preside over the deaths of 2 devoted believers who handed over all their land and possessions to the Christ sect, but condemned the sin of keeping little for themselves? Why would Jesus reappear after his death only to an obscure few rather than to a multitude, or to his enemies who never believed he was the Messiah? What evidence do we have that the dead can be resurrected? Emperor Constantine sought to silence Porphyry's voice by destroying his treatises. Later, pro-Christian emperors also burned pagan critiques of Christianity. A century after the Constantine, in 448, all surviving copies of Porphyry's work were condemned to the flames by church authorities. Other notable pagans whose anti-Christian polemics were torched include Celsus, Galen, Lucian, and Julian the Apostate. One of today's historians who look at favorably upon early Christians, Stuart Perowne, makes no mention of how they relentlessly eradicated critical pagan literature. Of Celsus's book, The True Word, Perowne comments laconically, quote, "This we do not possess," without explaining why we do not possess it. He assures us that Celsus puts forth the usual appeal and all the familiar arguments against the Christian faith, though he offers not a hint of what these familiar arguments might be. Perowne then offers to the 8 volumes of Origen's learned and great apologetic works against Celsus, quote, "all have come down to us." The reader is left with the impression that it was just by happenstance that Origen's writings survived intact while Celsus's works entirely lost to us. We know of Celsus's critique only as much as Origen chooses to tell us. Some of the Christian texts that incorporated sections of Porphyry's polemics solely for the purpose of rebuttal were themselves burned in order to eradicate what the bishop of Apollinaris called the poison of his thought. In sum, a rich corpus of critical literature, one whole side of a monumental debate that lasted over 2 centuries, is mostly lost to history because of the ascendant side chose to silence its opponents by force when it could not do so by reasoned argument. Well, shit, so much for the tolerant Christians. Centuries of literature lost, all because you can't win an argument. Accepting the powers that be. Christianity is sometimes credited with cleansing Western society of pagan decadence, and with standing against class power and privilege. Quote, by renouncing all of the pagans world has covered and striven for, writes Lewis Mumford, quote, the Christian took the first steps towards building a new fabric out of the wreckage, unquote. It is a dubious hypothesis. Far from renouncing the values and institutions of antiquity, the early church embraced Roman notions of law and property, and offered no resistance to the emperor's autocratic rule or the corruption and venality of royal entourage, no opposition to the aristocratic wealth and entitlements, no objection to the merciless tax machine and the harsh criminal law, and no noticeable protest against poverty, slavery, female subjugation, and most other social issues. What is certain, remarks Aram Vartanian, quote, is the Christianization of the Roman Empire did nothing to democratize or liberalize its laws. Rome continued to be what it would now call a military dictatorship, even under the best of its emperors, unquote. The church accommodated itself with the existing imperial absolutism, and even set up the bishops of Rome as spiritual emperors in their own domain. Writing in the Wall Street Journal, conservative historian Elizabeth Fox Genovese gives credence to another specious time-worn notion. Quote, it was Christianity and the concept of individual freedom that the concept of original freedom originated. Unquote. Don't make me laugh. In fact, long before Christ, during the Roman Republic and before the ancient Athens and other Greek city-states, there existed pagan jurists and democratic leaders who expressed concern for the right of citizens against privilege and arbitrary state power. Fox Genovese notwithstanding, one is hard to locate in the entire corpus of early Christian thought and advocacy of individual freedom against secular or ecclesiarchal power. Such a concept is not to be found in Paul, Jerome, Ambrosia, or Augustine. If anything, we repeatedly encounter a ready acceptance of autocratic secular powers and an eagerness to enlist to hunt down heretics, free thinkers, reformers, and other purveyors of heterodoxy. In Europe, both before and after Reformation, whether in Protestant or Catholic countries, the established ecclesiastics usually sided with the prince against the peasants, showing little sympathy for the democratic rights of commoners, even as late as the French Revolution and the uprising of 1848, which raised the banner of individual rights against monarchist rule throughout Europe. Catholic and Protestant churchmen sided overwhelmingly with the anti-democrats. Go figure. Throughout the Middle Ages, the church hierarchy opposed workers' guilds, and through the 18th and 19th century, even into much of the 20th century, Catholic and Protestant churches were more likely to oppose than to support labor unions. Not long after Jesus' death, the Apostle Paul counseled total obedience to the state, the very Roman state that had crucified his Savior, claiming that in Romans 13:1 that, quote, the powers that are ordained by God, unquote. Since there exists no authority save by act of God, it followed that those who do not submit to early rulers are in effect resisting celestial authority, quote, and shall receive to themselves damnation, unquote. Preaching while that homicidal autocrat Nero was sitting on the throne, Paul assures that his followers that the rulers is both virtuous and benign. Virtuous and benign. I lost my spot. Damn it. Oh, here it is. Working for the good of all and ready to punish evildoers. He deserves obedience not only out of fear, but also for conscience sake, for he is the minister of God. So should people render tributes, taxes to the authorities, so they do God's service. Soon after this, at the instigation of a rival Christian faction, Paul himself is said to have been arrested and executed by the divinely ordained secular authorities. Did Christianity ameliorate the plight of the poor, as is often supposed? In fact, once the Roman Empire became impoverished, especially in the West, reached new extremes, quote, with enormous riches concentrating in the hands of the senatorial class, unquote. Quote, distinctions of rank and degree multiplied and the inequalities of property widened, unquote. The year 332 saw the promulgation of a law binding all colony and their progeny to the estates upon which they labored. Henceforth, they could neither flee nor be released by their masters. By reducing free peasants and to the legal status of serfs, ecclesiastical and secular landholders secured a permanently cheap labor supply. Similarly, in the towns, membership in crafts and trades were unalterably fixed with no possibility of transfer. Two privileged groups exempted from these onerous laws were landowners and high officials. Quote, as for the role of the Christians, the Christian church in all of this, even Vaught grudgingly allows, quote, it cannot be said to have voiced any protest against the subjugation of the middle and lower orders, unquote. In sum, contrary to conventional beliefs, Christianity launched no great challenge against the dominant socioeconomic order. The church raised no outcry against the inequitable social religions that bred poverty, slavery, wars of conquest, as well as patriarchal domination, homophobia, cruelty to animals, and the like. Under the Christianized Roman Empire, taxation became still more oppressive, and criminal law grew increasingly severe. Crucifixion was abolished, but burning people alive at the stake became a favored mode of execution, a way of killing someone without technically violating the structure against shedding blood. During the, quote, post-classical era, writes Joseph Vaught, pagan jurists were, quote, partially responsible for an increasing brutality in criminal law and in one forms of punishment. Numerous crimes were subject to the death penalty, often carried out in hideous fashion. Vaught avoids mentioning that the, quote, post-classical era was the Christian era, and that the increasing brutality of Roman law occurred during a time of Christian ascendancy. The practice of torture and mutilation, applied by the Romans in their judicial proceedings, well, hold on. The practice of torture and mutilation applied by the Romans in their judicial proceedings under severely limited circumstances now became more common and was sanctioned by law. Ordeal by torture replaced the trial, the sack, the rack, the wheel, the stake, the spiked collar, the spiked bed, the spiked box, thumb screws, branding irons, scalding bats, and hot pincers became part of Christianity's hideous new arsenal in the war against heretics and infidels. Punishment by ordeal, involving everything from branding and whipping stocks and ducking stools, carried into Protestant regions centuries after, including the new settled communities in North America. Ooh, sounds like my girlfriend's closet. Some things did change for the better. By the 5th century, an end was put to the bloody extravaganzas and the amphithytator. Never one to mince words, Augustine referred to the Roman games as, quote, filth of the Cynician pastimes, unquote. Christian leaders generally opposed the arena not so much for its bloodletting and brutality, but for the pagan rites and processions and the cult-like homage paid to the emperor at such events. There were other Christian reforms. The church abolished human sacrifice and other denounced infanticide. Certain prison conditions were made less harsh, at least on paper. Unilateral divorce, an exclusively male prerogative, was made more difficult, and as the keeping of concubines by married men. The bishops ruled that the prohibition against idolatry applied to husbands as well as wives, which has not been so among the Roman pagans. But under early Christian codes, the husband of an adulteress could compensate for his injury by remarrying, while the wife of an adulterer not. Those who celebrate Christianity's contributions to Western civilization might want to remind themselves of one of the Church's most appalling gifts to human history, the Inquisition, a hearsay hunt ordained by the papacy that wreaked misery upon Europe with the early 20th century until well into the 18th. Endowed with nearly limitless authority, shrouded in secrecy, and freed from all accountability, the inquisitors indulged in unfettered butchery and rapacity, taking lives and confiscating property, growing rich in the process, treating the accused as having no rights, and treating everyone, from the meanest to the highest, as potentially suspect. The victim's guilt was assumed in advance, and confession was to be extracted by guile or ordeal. One's regular church attendance and generous oblations, one's verbal professions of strict devotion to orthodox doctrine, one's willingness to subscribe to whatever that was demanded by the tribune, all were sought, all were not, or all were as not. For the accused might still be nursery as secret history, the Inquisition had to undercover the impossible, the unspoken thoughts in a person's head, but luckily the task was made easier by the procedure itself. The victim need not to be proven guilty. Suspicion alone was enough to bring on the fatal judgments. The inquiry almost always ended in execution or, even less frequently, life incarceration in a dark dungeon. Along with its judges, the Inquisition had its armed retainers, extortionists, spies, and of course, torturers and executioners. Lee writes that among the Visigoths, torture had been unknown amongst the barbarians who funded the commonwealths of Europe, and their system of jurisprudence had grown up free from its contamination. Unquote. Not until the 13th century did it begin to be employed, sparingly and hesitatingly, in judicial proceedings, after which it rapidly won its way into the Inquisition, administered at first only by secular authorities, on command from the inquisitional tribune. In 1252, church canons prohibited ecclesiastics from being present when torture was administered, perhaps an implicit admission that the procedure was morally tainted. Yet with few years, inquisitors and their servitors were absolving each other of irregularities under the papal bull so that they might directly supervise torture sessions. Those who confessed were burned as admitted heretics. Those who withstood all the pain and mutilation and did not confess were burned as unrepented heretics. Heresy itself retained a conveniently vague and elastic meaning. Prisoners who confessed under torture were tortured again to gain information about other evildoers among their own family and friends, then tortured again if they subsequently recounted any of the court's testimony, after which they were burned at the stake. Witnesses, too, were sometimes tortured in order to extract properly damning testimony. Anyone who showed sympathy or supported for the accused, who dared to question the relentlessly self-confirming process, was doomed to meet the same fate. In 1484, German princes were reluctant to give the Roman Inquisition entry into Germany. The Inquisition loomed as a rival authority, one inclined to go into business for itself, condemning not only the poor but some of the rich and well-born and expropriating their estates. But the grave anxiety occasioned by peasant insurrections made the princes more tractable. The Inquisition's opportunity to arrive upon the scene, in Michelet's words, to terrorize the country and break down rebellious spirits, burning as sorcerers today the very men who would likely enough tomorrow have been insurgents, channeling popular restiveness away from the ruling interests and against witches and demons. One immortal character whom Christian mythology let loose upon the world with renewed vigor for the better part of 2,000 years was Satan, endowed with unflagging potency excelled by no one save God himself. The devil excluded an evil presence that inspired churchmen to evils of their own. Sometimes Satan displayed a ubiquity that even the Almighty did not seem able to emulate. The more the evil one was hunted down, the more he surfaced everywhere, until God's world seemed to be. Indeed, among his various titles were, quote, the Prince of Darkness and, quote, the Prince of the World, and, quote, Ozzy Osbourne. No, I'm just kidding. Beheld in the depths of night or in broad daylight, on shadowy lanes or by well-lit hearths, in bedrooms and even church pews, Satan incarnate was a protein genius who could assume the form of any creature or object, able to occupy any space, including the bodies of ordinary mortals. Thus did inquisitional judges sometimes tremble when the be-ragged widow or frightened shepherd was hauled before them, for these simple-minded devils of shepherds and sorcerers might take with them the ambition to enter an inquisitor. Unquote. Some historians actually have apologetic words for the Inquisition, ignoring all evidence to the contrary. Carlton Hayes and his associates claimed the Inquisition's most frequent penalty was a mere fine and confiscation of property, with imprisonments reserved only for, quote, more severe cases, and some suspects were required to undertake expensive pilgrimages or wear distinctive markings on their clothes. Hayes makes no mention of torture and claims that their death penalty was applied only to the relative few who refused to recant their heresy or who relapsed after recantation. The inquisitors, it seems, did not burn heretics, but consciously strove to save their immortal souls through conversion. A different summation of the Inquisition is offered by Leah, who has done the monumental study of the subject, fantastic zeal, arbitrary cruelty, and insatiable cupidity. It was a system which might as well seem the invention of demons. In fact, it was the invention of the Christian church of the day. A religion is not something entirely apart from crimes committed in its name. A church's war against heresy began in the first generation, and of its existence and continued without stints for more than 1600 years. Centuries of Christianity means spirited, violent propagation of monopoly. Faith created the fertile soil upon the Inquisition took root and flourished. Affluent believers. A popularly accepted view, as the writer puts it, is that Christianity's converts were drawn into an overwhelming majority from the lowest classes of society. Unquote. Another, another maintains that Christian proselytizers made their earliest inroads, quote, chiefly, if not exclusively, among the obscurer and poorer classes. Unquote. Another claims that Christianity was busy planting itself among the poor and ignorant and deriding its support for centuries from the laboring man. Unquote. Certainly, numbers of Jesus worshippers were drawn from their lower ranks since the vast majority of people were of modest means. But early Christ sects were not primarily vehicles of the downtrodden and misbegotten. They took root within settled communities, rich merchants as well as poor workers, prosperous slaveholders as well as slaves, attracting a disproportionate number of middle and upper class people, including such contemporaries of Jesus as Joseph of Arimathea, Sergius Paulus, governor of Cyprus, and Publius, the head citizen of Malta. Jesus himself appears not too troubled with the plight of the poor. When his apostles criticize a woman who poured precious ointments on his head, for this ointment might have been rich and given to the poor, unquote, he praises the woman for having, quote, wrought a good work upon me, and advises his disciples to not worry themselves, for ye have yet poor always with you, but me you have not always, unquote. The act of the apostles reveals that Paul, himself, an educated upper-class Roman citizen, converted a number of propertied persons, such as Erastus, steward of the city, at Corinth, Crispus, the chief ruler of the synagogue in Corinth, and Felix, a noble Roman officer, and his wife, King Agrippa Phoebe, the patroness of many, Lydia, a wealthy trader in purple, a luxury product, and Greek and Jews in the city of Ephesus, who responded to Paul's preaching by destroying their books valued at 50,000 pieces of silver. As with any sects, the Jesus proselytizers were not indifferent to converting persons whose wealth and rank would land prestige and material assistance to their cause. Quote, mindful of their precarious status in Roman society, notes Torgeson, quote, the Christian communities looked to members with social status and wealth to be patrons, and to functions as their protectors. During Christianity's earliest decades, various apostles were dependent on persons' means of means for their existence, including the cost of their many voyages. Paul and Barnabas journeyed to distant shit. Paul and Barnabas journeyed to distant Pisidian Antioch, less because they were moved by the Holy Spirit and more because of Cypriot's governor directed them to the area where his family had land, power, and influence. In time, the Christian clergy came to live completely off the offering of their parishioners. This chapter is making me really hate religion right now. By the 3rd century, aristocratic converts were being moved quickly into leadership positions in the church. Cyprian of Carthage, a pecunious landowner and a pecunious, I'm learning a new word every day. A pecunious landowner and aristocrat became a benefactor of the church after his conversion and was easily elected bishop, although he was still only a catechumen and had not even been baptized. Louis Schrock maintains that the early church was populated mostly by persons of modest means, yet she observes that, quote, rich women and educated men, quote, made invisible the gospel of the poor and came to play a predominant role in church organization. From I Timothy and 1 Timothy and 1 Peter to the treatises of Tertullian, church leaders felt it necessary to urge Christian women to eschew elaborate ornaments, jewels, gold, finery, and cosmetics. Such admonitions were so persistent, we might infer because enough female church members could offer elaborate attire. There was a notable presence of moneyed women in Egeria, who in Jerome's time revealed itself as a well-read scripture and worthy of the hospitality of great bishops and monks. There was also Melania the Younger, born into a wealthy Roman family, and at the end of the 4th century, who taught the Emperor Theodosius and polemicized against heresy. Elevation in the church hierarchy came not only to those affluent backgrounds, but to those who won the patronage of rich backers. In the middle of the 3rd century, for instance, the wealthy matron Lucilia brought the bishopric of Carthage for her servants Majorinus with a large amount of silver. An unidentified Christian woman of wealth financed Origen's education and launched his career as the foremost theologian of the Greek-speaking churches. Origen's vision was of a church led by upper-class males who gave guidance to those elements in society who needed it: workers, women, the poor, and uneducated. In 212, Tertullian informed the governor of his province that Christians permeated every stratum of Carthaginian society. Quote, men of your own rank among them, noble ladies, and all of the outstanding persons of the city, unquote. In the eastern cities, likewise, affluent Christians were already serving on town and city councils, funding civic games and working as magistrates, lawyers, and other professionals in provincial cities. During the first few years of Valerian reign, the emperor's secretariat was staffed mostly by Jesus worshippers. Valerian himself evidently believed in the Roman knights, senators, and ladies of quality were involved in the Christ sect. If early church fathers like Augustine, Ambrosia, and Jerome championed a church of indignant and oppressed, of slaves and penniless peasants, they gave remarkably little evidence of it. Descended from an aristocratic Roman family, Ambrosia acquired a liberal education, hobnobbed with Roman nobility, and served as a consultor of Liguria. At age 34, before he had received the sacraments of baptism, Ambrosia was transformed from governor to Archbishop of Milan. Jerome maintained a literary correspondence which cultivated persons all over the world and socialized with prosperous parishioners, one of which his students being the wealthy Pammachius. Another of Jerome's close acquaintances was Paula, a Roman matron of considerable wealth and social standing who founded monasteries. While living in Rome from 1382 to 1385, Jerome, quote, taught asceticism to a circle of wealthy women for whom the instructions have been an uplifting divertimento. As befitting the devotees of Jesus, affluent church leaders sometimes downplayed their own prosperous origins. While serving as bishops of Hippo, Augustine announced sermon in a sermon in 356, quote, "A gift of costly raiment may sometimes be presented to me as becoming apparel for the bishop to wear, but it's not becoming for Augustine, who is poor and who is the son of poor parents. The bishop was seriously misleading his congregation. He and his parents were anything but poor. Never in his life did he suffer material want. As a youth, Augustine frequented the baths and was sent to Carthage to pursue his studies. Like the upper class young men, like the upper class young men, he supported a concubine, a woman who he would not marry because of her low social rank, but with whom he lived for 15 years and raised a son. Early in his career, Augustine was appointed to the prestigious chair of rhetoric in Milan, where members of the imperial court were in residence, and for a number of his adult years he resided on his portion of the family estate in the Gast. On the occasion, Bishop Augustine admonished his congregation for failing to take up a clothing of collection for the poor. This suggests that the congregation itself was not poor, just not very charitable. Augustine himself associated mainly with well-appointed Christians. There was Nebridius, a close friend of whom, quote, had an excellent family estate and a house; Dioscorus, a young Greek; Alypius, a Carthaginian youth, both of whom could afford to study abroad; Romanius, a man of great riches whose wealthy male companions also associated with Augustine; Pontanatius, who accompanied a high office in the emperor's court; Innocentia, whom Augustine describes as a very devout woman of highest rank in his state; Hesperius, a large property owner; Veruncundus, whom the Symptomus estate of Augustine retreated for a time; Largus, a proconsul in Africa; Count Darius, imperial agent sent to Africa; Boniface, a military commander of the Roman army; Cassicanius, described by Augustine as, quote, a man of high rank; Proba, a widow of a man who was said to have been the wealthiest individual in the Roman Empire, said Paulinius, who acquired great wealth by the two quickest means, inherited and marriage, and who was a bishop of Nola, erected a majestic ballista for the congregation and the lavish dwelling for himself and his rich wife. Not without reason does one modern-day Catholic scholar, Abbot Riccati, conclude that the Christians were, quote, not inferior to the pagans and often superior in social status. Many were, quote, cultured and learned, held high offices in the state, and were leaders of their communities. Vogt would have us believe that the wealthy church of the post-Constantine era had resources and dedication, quote, to relieve poverty and distress, shouldering the task of relieving misery wherever it was found, unquote. But how could the church muster sufficient resources to alleviate, quote, misery wherever it found? When poverty and misery were so widespread, how could the church attend so generously to the impoverished multitude while not draining its own coffers and, indeed, while continuing to amass more and more wealth for itself? Individuals and organizations became rich not by giving away treasure, but by accumulating it. Rather than in sharing the wealth, the upper clergy busily shared in wealth. So by the 250s, there were men like Paul of Samosta who, while occupying the metropolitan see of Antioch, accumulated a vast personal fortune by extorting frequent contributions from the most opulent of the faithful. The church proved less than immune to temporal blandishments. As early as the 4th century, corruption, luxury, and declining morals had become a serious problem amongst the clergy and vagabond monks who, quote, wandered about in search of legacies and inheritances. In July 370, Emperor Valentinian instructed the Pope that male clerics and unmarried ascetics must stop lurking about the homes of affluent women and widows with the mind to insinuating themselves or their church into the ladies' bequests. 20 years later, his successor deplored these despoilers of the weaker sex. while conceding that the law had not stopped them. Apparently, neither had the Pope. By the reigns of Constantine, most of the bishops, many of the priests and deacons, and some minor clergy and monks were or had been who had never done any productive work. In the centuries to follow, the higher clergy became the special province of the sons of moneyed and pedigreed families. Men who invested in their energies wholly in maintaining their land estates and increasing their revenues. In time, priests were appointed by the nobility, while church offices were sold outright to the highest bidder. As of the late 6th century, the church owned hundreds of thousands of slaves who worked in its immense holdings in Gaul, Italy, Greece, Syria, Egypt, and other parts of northern Africa, with bishops enjoying outcomes considerably larger than those of any provincial governor. In Italy alone, the church possessed 1,600 square miles of the best land. The papacy was a preeminent feudal overlord, claiming amongst its fiefs not only a number of towns and principalities, but the kingdom of Portugal, Aragon, Poland, Sicily, Hungary, and for a time, England. Rather than relieving misery wherever it was found, the church. Yeah, let me try that again. Rather than relieving misery wherever it was found, the church, throughout most of its early history, performed no con- concerted missionary outreach to impoverished rustics and latifundious slaves. With Christianity a predominantly urban movement, the great mass of rural poor remained largely inaccessible to illiterate preachers like St. Paul, who traveled from the city to city. Quote, the priests and persons in slavery, on the other hand, were the most underprivileged classes. Christianity left them largely untouched, unquote. The downtrodden seldom had the leisure to indulge in pursuits relating to their immortal souls. The relatively few Christian clergy who ventured into the rural areas thought none too well of the impernicious inhabitants, in some cases considering them little better than clodhoppers and savages. A remark by Origen reveals a class bigotry that one might expect from high-ranking churchmen. Quote, not even a stupid man would praise the poor indiscriminately. Most of them have very bad characters, unquote. Beginning with Paul, Christianity focused attention on personal piety and individual salvation, offering no opposition to the unjust economic conditions of the day. This approach allowed the church to appeal to persons of high rank, including, eventually, the emperor himself, who would have been decidedly put off by any kind of egalitarian religio-economic agenda. The collusion with the temporal authority and the land continued well into Reformation. Martin Luther championed the cause of his rich and powerful patrons, the German provinces, and vehemently denounced the half-starved God. Overtaxed peasants who dared to rebel. The supposedly austere John Calvin was not immune to the blandishments of royalty, entertaining a 30-year friendship with the Duchess of Ferrara, whom he presented his first copy of his institutes. Christianity is not the only new religion to have attracted and been attracted to influential followers at its inception. The earliest converts to Islam were mostly young men of considerable privilege. Studies of the Mormon Church, Christian Sciences, and Unification Church, Hare Krishna, and various Hindu sects in Northern America show that followers are drawn predominantly from relatively affluent and better educated classes. By impression of the Buddhist groups in California, Colorado, New York, and Massachusetts, it is the participants are overwhelmingly college educated and middle and upper class. The Buddha himself was born in Siddhartha, Gautama, 560 BC, into a wealthy and privileged family in northern India. It seems that lower income working people, while not immune to evangelical enthusiasms, generally have neither the time nor inclination to pursue newly packaged esoteric belief systems. In the final analysis, contrary to the widely received view, Christianity prospered and triumphed because it aligned itself with the prosperous and the triumphant. The blood of the martyrs measured less than the commanding collaboration of secular authorities, the threat of the sword, the fires of the stake, and the worldly presence of the bishops. The worldly presence of the bishops. Saints for slavery. All right, last section. Saints for slavery. Enjoying wide currency is the notion that Christianity challenged the whole institution of slavery with the idea of brotherly love, as one historian puts it. Another claims that the post-Constantine Church obeyed Christian commands to, quote, set the captives free. In fact, the Church did no such thing. Sacred Christian texts have nothing critical to say about slavery. The Old Testament, incorporated as part of the Christian Bible, repeatedly, fucking bugs. Anyways, the Old Testament, incorporated as part of the Christian Bible, repeatedly condones the taking of slaves in war. In Numbers 31:17 to 18, after killing all the men of Midian, Moses instructs his soldiers to murder every male child and every mature woman, but, quote, all the women children, the child virgins, keep them alive for yourselves. So through much of the Old Testament, mass murder, pillage, rape, and the enslavement of foreigners are acceptable practices, sometimes mandated by the Almighty himself. The New Testament either keeps its silence or actually endorses slavery. St. Paul claims in Galatians 3:28 that there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Jesus Christ. Is sometimes mistakenly treated as an egalitarian avowal. In fact, he's simply dismissing worldly inequalities as being no great moment, ignoring his followers to focus on the higher, if less tangible, equality we presumably enjoy in God's eyes. One situation in life matters not, for God loves all, but with a love that leaves earthly inequalities much intact. Paul makes clear where lie his sympathies. He tells his followers to, quote, cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. He instructs servants to be obedient to them that are your masters, with fear and trembling in singleness of your heart, as unto Christ. He admonishes servants to obey in all things your masters, and to count your own masters worthy of all honor, that the name of God and his doctrine are not blasphemed. Since all authority comes from God, the master's command must be obeyed. When a runaway slave joins Paul's entourage to become a Christian, the apostle is faced with a problem. He is personally acquainted with the slave's master, Philemon, who was also a Christian and who hosts a church at his residence where Paul himself has been active. As a Christian, the runaway supposedly is now, like Paul's, quote, a prisoner of Jesus Christ, and in Christ everyone is equal. Yet the back to Philemon with a letter urging that he be treated, quote, not now as a servant, but above a servant, a brother's beloved, unquote. Paul had no critical word about Philemon's presumed right to treat another human being as his property. We had no record of why the slave had felt compelled to flee a presumably good Christian such as Philemon, nor how he was received upon being returned to his overlord. It should be noted that in most English translations of the New Testament and the writing of post-apostolic church fathers such as Augustine, we repeatedly encounter the misleading term servant, which in contemporary English denotes a free employee. To describe those who were actually slaves, Paul was not admonishing and reproaching servants as we understand the term, but slaves. The Greek doul and doulos are translated as maidservants and servants, when the fact when in fact they reference usually are made into slaves. In Latin, servus means servant or slave, with no real distinction between the two, and no suggestion of free labor, as in modern English. Servitude does not refer to service, but is synonymous with slavery, such as euphemistic translations to conceal the truly oppressive nature of social relations during early Christianity and their ready acceptance by certain apostles. In keeping with their own class backgrounds, the post-apostolistic saints and bishops are all drearily supportive of the ruling class and crimes of slavery. They are drearily supportive of the ruling class and crimes of slavery. St. John Chrysostom advises affluent Christian widows not to remarry since they themselves are perfectly capable of disciplining their slaves without need of husbands. St. Augustine considers slavery divinely ordained, a need for corrective, a needed corrective for some. He observes that even Daniel, that man of God, confessed to the Almighty that the sins of his people were the cause of their captivity. Quote, the prime cause, then, of slavery is sin. That is, the sins of the enslaved, not the enslaver. Servitude, quote, does not happen save by the judgment of God, with whom there is no unrighteousness, and who knows how to award fit punishments to every variety of offense. No slaveholder could have fashioned a more serviceable ideology. Regarding those exceptional instances when virtuous believers find themselves in bondage to wicked slave masters, Augustine offers this feeble reassurance. Quote, the lowly position does not much good to the servants as the proud position harm to the master, unquote. Echoing Paul, he urges slaves to serve their masters, quote, heartily and with good will, not in crafty fear, but in familial love. He concedes that God created none of us by nature to be slaves, but the present penal servitude, quote, is appointed by the law to preserve, quote, the natural order and forbids disturbances, unquote. Another illustrious saint for slavery is Ambrosia. For him, enslavement is a path to rectitude for, quote, the lower stations in life, the most exalted by virtue. Needless to say, the aristocratic exalts his own virtue by placing himself in servitude. For St. Ignatius, slaves should, quote, bear their slavery for the glory of God. And they should, and that, yeah, let me try that again. St. Ignatius, slaves should, one more time. St. Ignatius, slaves should, quote, bear the slavery for the glory of God, that they may win from him thereby a better liberty, unquote, in the next life. When Christian slaves proposed that their freedom be bought by the funds from an Asian church community, Ignatius opposed the move. He feared that once free to indulge themselves, they would become the slaves of desire. Early church authorities cautioned ordinary Christians against sheltering fugitive slaves. In the 3040s or the 340s, the Council of Gondra threatened to excommunicate and anathematize anyone who provoked slaves in insubordination. Slaves who took refuge in the church were returned to their owners after an inquiry, with a rebuke to whichever party was sought to deserve it, a procedure whose aftermath likely bore more heavily upon the slave than the slaveholder. The church did little to evangelize slaves, even their own by the worshippers of Christ. In time, the monasteries, being among the biggest landowners, numbered among the biggest slaveholders. Many Christian owners considered pagan slaves of better value than Christian slaves, so they would not have to be excused from work on the Sabbath. Slaves were regularly denied baptism until given a good testimonial by their Christian masters, and they were accepted into the church only with reluctance. Persons held in servitude were barred from ordination into the holy masters. As for an early pope and saint, Leo I noted, quote, the sacred ministry is polluted by such vile company, and the rights of owners are violated, unquote. An early church council in Spain, ruled by Christian women who beat their maidservants to death, were to be punished by being denied Holy Communion for several years. Oh, so harsh. The relatively mild sanction bespeaks the slight value placed on a slave's life by ecclesiastical authorities. It is easier to find pagan writers who were critical of slavery than Christians. The pagan Roman jurist Florentinius commanded servitude as, quote, contrary to nature, and the younger Seneca vigorously denounced the inhumane treatments of slaves, but stopped short of advocating for their emancipation. Occasionally, Christian writers deplored the enslavement of Christians, but they accepted the enslavement of heathens, a practice that became especially praiseworthy in later times if it led to forced conversion. Indeed, from the 15th to the 18th centuries, Christian missionaries in their search of forced conversions became actively connected to slave traffickers In sum, there was nothing in early Christian teachings and practice that rejected slavery and much that supported it. So it was for over 1,000 years through the entire Middle Ages. There were a few minor exceptions, such as Pope Gregory the Great, whom, upon freeing two of the churches, Fuck. Oh, oh, you guys there? Okay, good. Let's wrap this up. Uh, Yet Gregory ordered no widespread manumission except Christian slaves owned by Jews. I'm going to go and wrap this up. But there were individual Christian dissidents more than a century before the Mennonites. In the early 1500s, in Senato de Mogo, Bartolome de las Casas and a few other clergies, including the Dominican Antonio de Montesinos, probably the earliest champion of Indian rights, preached against the enslavement of West Native Americans. Las Casas prevailed upon Pope Paul III to issue a papal bull declaring that indigenous peoples had reasons and souls and were therefore entitled to freedom. Las Casas eventually came out against the use of African slaves as well. Such voices were the rare exceptions that should not distract us from many Christian friars who not only supported but profited from the cruel vassalage imposed upon native populations, be it from Mexico, Peru, Hispaniola, California, or the Philippines. Regarding the Philippines, under Spanish rule, the priests and friars took possession of the lands without beneficial legal title, quote, until they were in positions of absolute dictatorship in their respective parishes, unquote, writes Charles Olcott. Quote, enormous rents were charged and the people were taxed without mercy, who affairs were held the land, escape all taxation and accumulated fortunes. Many stories were circulated and not denied of gross immorality on part of priests, besides rapacity and cruelty. In California and the Caribbean, the missions were centers for enslaving indigenous populations, forcing the natives to work under conditions that amounted to slave labor. There we go. Anyways, fuck, I'll just keep holding it. All right. For centuries, the church was the largest slaveholder in Europe. As late as the 16th century in Spain, Christians were still debating whether African slaves had souls or were subhuman animal creations. Well, in the 19th century in the United States, while some clergy joined the abolitionist ranks, many more remained vigorous apologists for slavery, writing almost half of all defenses on its behalf, often citing the Bible as their authority. Interesting. Prominent pro-slavery clergy would be found in the North as well as in the South. It cannot be held that Christians preached one thing on Sunday and practiced another for the rest of the week. In respect to in respect to slavery, preachment and practice coincided all too well, whether during the late Roman Empire or in the antebellum United States. Christian teachings offered an ideological justification for the worldly interests of a ruthless slaveholding class, and Christians themselves were among the leading slave owners. Few of us were taught such things in Sunday school or in any other school. And that's the end of the chapter. So, that's it. That is it. Next time, Dragon Ball Z, we read chapter 3. After I flipped through all these works cited. Damn, there were 137 citations in that chapter. Bishops and barbarians, Jezebels and Jews. We will talk of that one next, but for now, I have to get ready for a debate. Y'all have a nice day. We will do this some other time.